Thank you very much, dear friends and dear colleagues. I've already said I'm Vladimir Duncan. Sometimes I have to hurry. I'm always in the hurry, and it's great that story really unites us. It unites the past, the present, and the future. And on the 20th of May, here today, we meet to discuss story gathering as a way to analyze corporate culture. And I was ahead of myself. I thought it was the 21st of May today. And it's great because we have so great speakers today, and they told us that culture really depends on stories, and culture is manifested through stories of particular people. And there's a major story of a company, and Jeff told us about that. And let's see where we can find and collect these stories and how we can help these stories to be heard. Just 5 years ago, storytellers, people who talk a lot, who say a lot of things, were very different. But recently we realized that people who work with stories, they are trying to listen more. At the previous conference in March 2021, that was my last slide of the presentation, page of the presentation. But today I'd like to share with you what I was able to discover for myself this year. And I'll tell you about some things I ran into, I encountered in my life. So we'll discuss how we can manage the unpredictable world. So in order to be able to listen to a story, we need somebody. When we analyze it and create models about stories, we need to have a counter agent, so to say, who'd look maybe like that, or probably that would be a girl from a reception stand or a vice president. So someone who would tell us about some corporate myths, some stories about clients, about some cases of cooperation, or some anecdotes about some marginals, or about some unique people in the company. And when we meet such a person, when we discuss with issues with such people, then it becomes very clear what is going on. And when I'm referring to a girl from reception stand, here I mean, for example, someone who sells tickets, and I'm referring to one particular woman who told me a lot about the attitude to clients of those who are selling tickets, and about the relationships of relationships between her and her colleagues who sell tickets to museums. And when you want to find someone who can tell you a story, the best question to ask is, who helps you most? Who do you think is most helpful to girls who sell tickets in museums? These are those people. That's what they look like. Well, it's clear that there are some concrete examples, some anecdotes that enabled us to understand that people at the front desks at museums, mostly they cooperate with security guys. And of course, it's great to listen to them and try to collect stories by talking with them. And it's not easy because such respondents are not very talkative. And they would rather give you answer yes or no. You can pass or you cannot pass. But we need to learn how to talk with them as well, because maybe they will help us to see an aspect of the culture that used to be hidden from us. It's a serious challenge for someone who studies culture, but we need to try and find culture even in the places where it's not very convenient for us to try and find some aspects of the culture. So what questions can we ask in order to start a dialogue and get as much information from the storyteller, so that this information would be, these insights would be beneficial for us? Because these people, these guys, they don't work by using their words, right? So for me, I think the most important thing in such cases is to value a particular approach to analyzing the story. At the very beginning of this century, we came across the appreciative inquiry. We had a great presentation of a colleague on this topic, and I think Mary Alice spoke on the first day of this conference, and her speech was very instrumental. In detail, she told about the appreciative inquiry and its use in storytelling, and based on my experience, I can say that questions just give us direction. It's just the starting point that refers us to, that lets us get to the story, and then we can continue the dialogue and try to make the storyteller follow us. So we create the environment. The appreciative inquiry is based on the principle of constructionism. In other words, you create and form a story, probably together with a participant. And that's what we're going to talk in detail about today. The principle of being in the moment simultaneously, the poetical principle, so you don't wait for some additional factors, some additional parts of the context in order to collect the story. What you're receiving, that's what you get. In the story, everything is important. You can enrich it by as many contextual interesting details as possible. There's also the principle of being able to predict what will happen in the future. Indeed, it's a very complicated topic. It's a topic for a separate discussion. And finally, the positive principle. So we listen to stories about what people like, about what they think is their main strength. And that's how we understand that if someone is working in an organization where there is some corporate culture, this organizational culture gives this person the strength. So let's try to identify what is the origin of this strength. Last March, I mentioned the approach. I'd like to dwell a little bit more today. This is the approach that I use. It's based on 3 P's: pride, recommendations of promo, and perspective. How you see the future. So these 3, let's call them questions, they can start a story that will reflect the culture. If you want to collect many stories that reflect the culture, you can use all 3 questions. The first one is, why do you like working here in this organization? Educated people who work in Russia, they usually try to generalize. In this case, it's better to ask a different question. When you come home, you having dinner and your mother, your wife Your child comes up to you and they ask you, why are you in such a good mood when you came back from work? So in this case, what are you going to tell them? You're not going to tell them about KPIs, about corporate values. You will tell that you were able to help some of your colleagues, or a colleague was able to help you when you felt like there was no way out of the situation. As for the analysis of the corporate culture, based on my experience, I can say that these stories about the cooperation, about being able to help each other, these stories are the most popular. This mutual help turns into a very important corporate value, although it's not usually mentioned in the corporate values list. Another question, the second question, is related to recommendations or promo. So let's create a context, right? If you meet, let's say, a friend for a cup of coffee, probably it's a meeting of graduates, and your friend asks you, what's about your work? Don't you think I should probably start working at your company as well? What would be your answer? And it turns out that this question is the best one to start an interview. Sometimes those who answer this question, they can say, well, in my company there's stability. Well, you can come up with a proposal and people will listen to you. But even not only the interviewer, but also those who are answering your questions, in this case, they would still ask you, what do you mean they support the initiative? Did something happen at your company? So then you will need, in very simple words, to explain what initiative you came up with and how other colleagues will support this initiative. Then you can also add another question to this one. What should remain in your organization so that in 2024, in 2025, you will continue working at the same place? How will you see that the opportunities remain the same at the organization? And thanks to these opportunities, you continue working here. Once I had a 25-minute interview, and the storyteller gave me a lot of stories and examples of how convenient it is to work for a trader, that he's always supported with products. And I thought that maybe here indeed we have the reflection of the culture, the spiral type of the culture, corporate culture. But then I still ask the question, traders, they're very dynamic people. For them, it's very easy to skip jobs to shift to another job if the parameters are better at a new job. And this trader told me, for me, it would be great if this atmosphere remains the same. And by atmosphere, I mean the opportunity to experiment, to try new things, and not being afraid of making a mistake. But do you always have the opportunity to make a mistake? Are mistakes allowed in your organization? So these are the questions you can use to launch the conversation with our storyteller. But let's try to understand how we can support our storyteller. So there's a model of telling a story. Why do we need a story? What is a story about? And getting back to appreciative inquiry, I can say that this approach was developed for involving people in the transformation programs that were aimed at changes. And the discussions with workers were based on the idea that we need to move from the current state to a new state. And that was a very important question, and instruments and tools were needed for that. A story is something that helps us to get from the beginning to the end of the story. And in the middle, there should be something. So this is a very simple definition of a story. But we can also say that according to Watts, a story can be compared to crossing a bridge. So it's like a plot. The model is well known. I'm not going to dwell on it for a long time. But when we analyze a story, we usually can identify such bridges, and through our questions we can help make a story. So the story needs a context. And at the very beginning of my work with corporate narratives, I made a common mistake. I very quickly went through the context in which the story was set in, but the right description of the context and the impulse that enables us to move away from this status enables us to identify how the story is going to develop in the future. If a respondent is not very responsive to these 3P questions, then we can ask the following question. When you first entered your office, how did you feel? And in this case, the respondent might say, you know, the manager stood up immediately. She walked towards me to greet me, and it was 5 years ago, but this reaction of the manager, of the immediate manager, is still remembered by this worker because it's the basis of the culture of the department and of the company. As for the impulse, something changes in the context. So a new person enters the office, is not, and also you can ask a question, for example, if someone new recently appeared in your office, what was the reaction? So in the story, there's always some purpose. The story won't happen if there's no surprise effect. There should be something that's not obvious. Otherwise, the story will turn into an instruction. What should your first day's work be? What can be unexpected? The curator turns out to be not very motivated, and the new worker needs to find motivation himself. Or, for example, a story can be told by a curator, by the mentor. There's a culture of mentors and curators in Russia. So, for example, a mentor or a curator can tell you that there was a surprising situation in the North Gas region. A worker was sent to that region in order to demount some of the equipment, and the worker didn't want to work in the dark because it becomes dark very early in the north regions. So the worker just leaves the equipment and returns back home. It was winter, and when the when the car made a swirl, all the equipment fell off the vehicle. So this worker returns to his station, and it turns out that the warehouse was already closed. So the worker just leaves all the equipment there, and he leaves, and next morning no one knows about that. And when his colleagues, his workers, the next day, instead of 3 hours, they had to spend 2 days to work with this equipment. So the reputation was lost of this worker, and there were a lot of expenses. And after that, the story is always told to new workers, because this story shows you the choice you can make. What is the key choice for the corporate culture? The worker was in a hurry. He didn't assemble everything as he was supposed to. Maybe that is the main idea of the story, or maybe you can see that people just do not follow the instructions. But the key issue is that this worker didn't communicate others about the situation. So this worker was just afraid that he would be punished, or he just thought the whole case was not interesting, so he decided not to tell other workers about the situation. Security and safety rules were not followed in this case, so this worker preferred to work faster. So this story shows us that the open communication in the team is very important. So even problems should be discussed in a team, and this choice shows us what is happening in the organizational culture. So we need to understand that the story can be both positive and negative. Of course, we are talking about the appreciative inquiry, but the stories can be different. So choice is the reflection of the culture. As for positive choice, probably I'll get back to the story about a security guard in a museum who just gave me answers yes and no when I tried to figure out what stories he can give to me. And that's why I said that it's very difficult to communicate with such people. And I needed to somehow come to the topic of the choice. And we, in our discussion, were able to find a story that he was proud of. The museum was huge, 3-story building. There are closed rooms in the building. And a 5-year-old boy got lost in the museum. He just ran somewhere, and his mother didn't see where he ran to, and the security guard has a choice before him: to help a child, a crying child, and to stay with the child until mom finds the child, or just remain at his main position where he's supposed to stay all the time. So he asked his colleague for help. So he talked with the boy. He tried to calm him down, and together they were able to find the child's mom. And this worker, the security guard, told me that I was in such a good mood when I was telling the story in the evening to my wife. And my wife told me that, indeed, your work sounds really interesting. What can we find in the choice? In the choice, there's a culture code. It's some component that defines the corporate culture. It's the main flag. What's identity for them? do we preserve cultural values, or are we people who take care of citizens? So if it's the second choice, then the security guard can hug a boy and help this boy find his mother in the museum. Or if it's the first choice, then the decision that the worker would have made would have been very different. So there are many values, different values and key norms within the team. The cashier who sells tickets at the museum said that, if there's a conflict, if the client asks, why didn't she tell me about the exhibition, the special exhibition that's taken place in the museum today, or why do I need to wear a mask, a facial mask? So based on the key norms of not being involved in the conflict and trying to make the dialogue positive, based on that, the cashier makes the choice that will reflect the culture. The cultural code can be the supportive system, or sometimes it can be hindering the people from making the right choice. I worked with one of the companies, and the results was among one of the managers and among one of the values. And I talked with the workers of this company, with the PR workers, and they told me that even if they had a task to talk about the security and safety, but still they turned the story into a story about the results. Of course, the result was above everything for them, but they came to a conclusion that security and safety, this is the issue that still needs to be addressed, and they were able to understand it by telling the stories. So there can be some binary oppositions that create not only the description of the culture, but also the structure of the culture. So when I told you about being initiative, at one of the corporate events, I heard a story about why you would invite a colleague to, your friend to work with you. And I received an answer that it was because of the ability to show initiative. And when you hear such stories, you can understand the structure of the company itself. And indeed, you can see that at this or that factory, there is an opportunity to protect to defend your ideas and to make your own choice. So there is the decision-making rule in this company, in this factory. So the manager is even ready to hear you, to listen to you until the decision is made. Or sometimes through the stories we can see that the management structure can be an authoritarian one. So based on that, we can build diagrams and pictures. You can see some of them on the screen. There are some structures that that support each other. There are some structures consisting of opposing elements. What we can see highlighted in violet, these are the stories that together with the author you needed to work upon. So in the table, by creating a table, you can show different types of the cultural codes. And last March, I asked the workers themselves to identify the cultural codes. And once I was able to start a very lively discussion through which the participants were able to build the stories themselves. At first they found the stories, then we discussed what is related to the status or impulses in the status in the story, what is related to the turn of the events of the story, and what is the main conclusion. And as a result, we were able to see that what is on the right, these are the elements of the cultural code, and they were able to identify them through conversations with each other. So this is one of the possible examples, and I'm sure that you can experiment this approach and use it in your mechanisms in your work. So I'll be happy to answer questions. This is going to be the end of my presentation. So if our storyteller is on its very difficult path, how can we help the storyteller? By using some so-called launching questions. If they don't work, then we can specify the context. So for example, it's your first day at work, or in the morning you meet with your colleagues. What can you tell them? What is happening at this moment? Or for example, there's a conflict with a client, with a customer. What would you do? So you just give the situations instead of asking questions. The third thing you can do, well, who could be the character of the situation? If the worker is experienced, what would he or she do? Or, for example, if there's a new guy at the office, what would he do? What the manager would do in this situation? Are there any mentors, curators? So you add some characters to help the storyteller, and also you ask questions about the choice. The storyteller tells you a story about the culture, and you ask what was the choice, what choices could be made. And you can continue working upon the story. What could you do in this or that situation? And when you specify and try to answer answers to these, to find answers to these questions in the positive manner, then you get the story that you need. And of course, the positive atmosphere is needed. You can give coffee, you can give tea, and try not to be very pushy with the respondents. Try to take a step back in order to give space to the storyteller, so that they would try to become closer to you by giving you answers. Once I had to interview people for Zoom in the middle of 2020. It was the middle of the pandemic, and when I was gathering stories, it turned out that a picture of the cafe would be great to have as the background in the Zoom for me, because it's the place where workers would meet when they worked in the office. And they said that with this background, it's so much easier to tell stories to each other. Thank you very much, dear friends. I'm happy to answer your questions, to discuss your suggestions, and on how we can better help our storytellers, our respondents, with telling us stories, the stories that reflect culture.
Уже вопрос сыпется тебе в чат, я оставил твои контакты, поэтому вот Евгений спрашивает, расскажите историю по поводу нашего светлого будущего, пожалуйста.
And I also shared your contacts. So Evgeny asks a question, tell us a story about the future, please. The first question in the chat, tell us a story about our bright future, please. Evgeny, thank you for the question. I very often have to tell this story, and I'd like to specify that here I mean not the story about our bright future, but the story about how through the future we can see the present. What should stay, what should remain in the future from today. Of course, we are living in the times when everything is changing. The global economic, social crisis and cultural crisis started in 2020. And in this situation, we can ask ourselves, based on what are we making the decisions, so that in 2025 we wouldn't be ashamed of telling about these choices to our friends, to our relatives. Because of course this question is very relevant today. Or probably we could hear a story about how you believed into something new, something fresh, something interesting, which is only starting to emerge through this fog that we're living in. And you not only were able to see this new thing, but also to believe in it. And I know that Artyom and I, we believe that stories will become a real tool for leaders, for consultants. And indeed, we are other methods that don't work, but we believe that stories will work today and in the future. Thank you. Tatiana asks you a question. How can we come up with these launching questions? Should they be general or concrete questions? Well, it's a very good question. How can we come up with such questions? How did I come up with my 3 Ps? We need a lot of practice. You need to try all the time. When you're constantly consulting people, you can check if these questions work or not by talking with your friends, with your family, and also try to find questions that start a story. A project is launched, or a project doesn't work, and one of my favorite launching questions is, tell me a story when you thought that something is impossible, but then it turned out that it is possible. So try to find these questions related to shifts. Evgeny, answering your questions, you need to believe that we do have positive stories, and we just need to find them. This is the main mission of my today's speech. Thank you, Tatiana. Thank you, Evgeny. And I think that I have a question from Artyom. Yes, and you can also stay in the chat, because we have a chat of our conference in Telegram. I'm going to share the link to this Telegram chat. It's going to be a working link this time, and you'll be able to answer Alona's question. She's our colleague working with the Academia Historia. And Vladimir, I have a question to you. What came first, the story or the culture? Well, I believe that at first there was a story. I know that you won't allow me to say that it's both, but I bet that at first there was a story, not about ourselves, but about other people. Once people realized that they're able to talk about themselves, they realized that they can talk about the story of the whole civilization. Great. Thank you. Let's use the fire signs to thank our speaker. Thank you for being able to join us, and thank you for your questions. And you told us that you were afraid that your speech probably wasn't going to be useful. Thank you very much.